Threadripper high-end desktop. The ASRock TRX50 WS workstation, but high-end desktop. It's not exactly workstation. I mean, there's Threadripper Pro. That's properly workstation. But this is the ASRock TRX50 workstation. This is high-end desktop Threadripper. This motherboard has 4 fans. I don't think I've ever seen a motherboard that has 4 fans. And they're not tiny fans. They're not loud fans. They're VRM fans. It's almost like AMD said, surprise, high-end desktop is back. And motherboard makers really had an impossibly short time to figure that out. There's really not a lot of TRX50 motherboards. But today I'm looking at the TRX50 WS, which has a couple of unique features that you won't find anywhere else, which is one of the things that I'm really excited about showing you. But also, TRX50, 32 cores, 64 cores, does this make sense for an enthusiast workstation? I mean, I like more cores. Y'all like more cores? I like more cores too. All right, let's take a deeper look. Uh, 18 plus 3 plus 3 power phases. The Threadripper Pro is only 350 watts. AMD is winning the efficiency game when it comes to CPUs, whether that's servers, desktops. It is an unquestionable lead. They are so far ahead in terms of efficiency. But enthusiasts, I know you're going to overclock. And so 2 of the 3 TRX50 boards have really solid power delivery for going well beyond 350 watts. You can enable PBO and get a lot more out of this. So this is an 18 plus 3 plus 3 power phase delivery. We're going to put that to the test. Don't worry. Also with TRX50, if you're looking at this platform, you might be an enthusiast for lots of PCIe devices and PCIe connectivity. This motherboard delivers. You have 5 slots, plus a plurality of M.2. Plus, you've also got a Gen 5 MCIO, mini cool edge connector. This is something that's popping up in servers. This MCIO connector should be the de facto standard going forward, and it should be in both 8 and 4 lane configurations. This motherboard just has the 1, but this is a Gen 5, maybe even Gen 6 capable connector that is way less headache than the repurposed Slim SAS connector that kind of sort of works at Gen 4 speeds if you hold your mouth right. If you've been following Level 1 for a long time, you know that we've been trying to get Gen 4 devices working through Slim SAS connections pretty much across the board. We've even gone through stuff like I'm Not Dead Yet Broadcom RAID controllers, which have, guess what? Yes, the mini SAS style connectors that can supposedly carry PCIe, but really only work through a backplane. It doesn't actually work if you just plug in with cables. And let me tell you, cables, oh yeah, the PCIe to that, there's no redrivers on this one, only works at Gen 3 speeds. MCIO to 8 SATA connectors, this is an 8-lane connector, yeah, we're all about that. What about the other mini SAS connector to 2 U.2 connections? Yep, we got that. What about MCIO to U.2? Yeah, we got that. We got the Kioxia CM7 that we're going to run off this motherboard at Gen 5 speeds because that is a true workstation class Gen 5 SSD. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Even before I show you the MCIO to M.2 adapter that you could plug an E1.S SSD directly in, and that's a 4 terabyte Intel E1.S SSD. Like, what is this madness? Like, is it... What's even happening? Motherboard, back on task, motherboard. The new high-end desktop platform is registered error correcting memory only, DDR5, registered error correcting memory, or error correcting memory in general in DDR5, well, except for UDIMMs, is a physically different DIMM. And desktop DDR5 memory has been a little problematic to bring up in a 2 memory channel desktop configuration. This is a 4 memory channel platform, so you have 4 DIMMs, 1 DIMM per channel. Even despite that, this platform will support up to 1 terabyte of memory because you can get 256 gigabyte DIMMs. They cost about $3 grand each, but you can get 256 gigabyte DIMMs and run this platform at a solid terabyte of memory. Our ASRock TRX50 WS motherboard also features Wi-Fi 6E. I wouldn't be surprised if that's updated to Wi-Fi 7, just, pay attention in the channel. At the rear, we've got our antenna connections, our BIOS flashback button and clear CMOS button, the stack of 4 Type A ports. You got 2 5 gig and 2 10 gig. And then we have our 2.5 gig LAN, then we have our 3.2 Gen 2 Type A and a 3.2 Gen 2 Type C. Those are 10 gigabit. And we've got our 10 gigabit LAN and a 10 gigabit Type A, and then we've got a 2 by 10 gigabit Type C. Then we got our analog microphone, our analog output, and our optical SPDIF. This is a 12-layer low-loss PCB. 12 layers! We've got 2 slim SAS connections at the front. Those are good for PCIe Gen 4, assuming you can find the appropriate cable. And then we've got our MCIO, which is a Gen 5x4, which is a lot easier to find Gen 5 cables. It is physically very similar to old Threadripper and Threadripper Pro, but electrically wildly incompatible because DDR5, PCIe Gen 5, and so on and so forth. In the motherboard bundle, you get a very nice Wi-Fi antenna. This is a separate movable Wi-Fi antenna, no rubber duck dongles, so really nice job there. The motherboard itself, which we'll come back to. The installation manual. ASRock has gone for a space-saving design if you do want to go for a dual power supply configuration. That is supported, and the 24-pin connector from the secondary power supply, you really only have to connect these 3 things to the motherboard, so it saves a lot of real estate on connectors you don't need. Otherwise, it uses mostly the 12-volt rail from that secondary power supply. You also got a couple of bundled analog ASRock Phantom Gaming temperature sensors that you can use with your breakout headers. You have 4 6 gigabit per second SATA connections, got some Velcro straps, your ASRock Phantom Gaming badge, and your M.2 mounting screws. Our primary X16 slot, slot 1, that's X16 Gen 5, and slot 3 is also Gen 5 X16. We've got a Gen 5 by 8, that's in slot 4, but slot 2 and slot 5 that are X16 are X4 and X8 electrical, also a Gen 4, but those are Gen 4 lanes directly into your CPU. So on board, this motherboard really doesn't have a huge number of M.2, but you do have a huge number of PCIe slots that you can break into 4 M.2 or 2 M.2 in the case of the 8-lane, because then you're putting your own MCIO connectors on a PCIe card to connect to your Kioxia CM7s or what other Gen 5 storage that you have. There's also the crucial T700, which is a perfectly reasonable M.2, but you know, I find 2 and 4 terabytes kind of restricting. A CM7 goes up to 30 terabytes. It's a little bit more my speed. Now before I throw this into a case, it's always nice to set it up on our test bench. And so to bring it up, I'm going to use the Arctic Freezer 4U-M. This is a really nice tower cooler that will fit in a 4U rack mount case. Probably one of the best tower coolers you can get for this socket, and it's the correct orientation. It's front to back airflow. On this motherboard, got a little bit of clearance issues. Fortunately, Arctic has 3D printable adapters, so you could use a different 120mm fan setup with this, including their P12 thin fans rather than the bundled fans with this. But for test bench configuration and what I'm ultimately planning for a build, it's not going to matter at all. We're also going to use the crucial T700 along with a Kingston Fury registered ECC memory for our initial setup. Now Threadripper, even high-end desktop, doesn't have an integrated GPU, and there's no way to take that back out with this. None of this platform has USB 4 or PCIe tunneling or anything like that. You might be able to add that with an add-in card. I'll have to experiment with that later. But this is just to bring up the platform. And this tower cooler, I know a lot of you would have questions about. It is very, very good in the server context, as well as it happens to be good in this context. Plenty of RAM clearance, plenty of all kinds of other stuff. Also, it's very important that you get airflow over registered error correcting DDR5 memory. Registered ECC memory will start to throttle, depends on the DIMM and the manufacturer, but 50 to 55 degrees C is safe, mostly. But when you start getting past about 55 degrees C, your DDR5 memory may throttle, and it may not give you any indication that it's throttling. So in this configuration, you want to make sure that you've got lots of airflow from front to back. And the orientation of this tower cooler, sort of unique among tower cooler options, really works very well with this layout. Now I'm planning to use our Gen 5 Kioxia SSD. Now this is, the crucial T700, this is a perfectly reasonable Gen 5 SSD. It's 1 terabyte. Our CM7, on the other hand, it's 11.7 gigabytes per second. Smoking fast for an M.2. You do have to keep it cool. I worry that underneath the GPU, this might not provide as much cooling as a T700 requires in all scenarios, but it is pretty awesome. Our CM7, Kioxia, can't say enough nice things about it. 14 gigabytes per second in a best case scenario off of that thing. It's U.2, it's physically bigger. It's going to use 25 watts of electricity just because it's got more power available to it because it's a different form factor. means that you're going to have a lot of horsepower. It's actually really interesting that the larger CM7s are not quite as fast as the 8 and 16 terabyte versions of the CM7, but you can get 30 terabytes if you really wanted to. I mean, that's going to be kind of pricey, but hey, we're building a workstation, right? Well, okay, this is more like enthusiast, but you know. For now, I'm going to use the Intel Arc GPU only because it's sacrilegious. Another reason for selecting this particular Arc GPU is the layout is the worst case scenario when it comes to your PCIe power connections. It's right next to your tower cooler. And yet, there's enough clearance. It works fine. Plenty of airflow, plenty of a gap between your tower cooler and your GPU. Not bad. Now, Arctic doesn't specify this tower cooler for overclocking. Let me be clear about that. But at the same time, this is also running at 350 watts flat plank. Our VRM fans are spinning, but they are barely audible. As far as VRM fans go, these are larger than they normally are, and so there's less of that high-pitched squealy whine from these particular fans that ASRock has chosen. That's very appreciated. I can also see from our temperature monitoring that the VRMs are not running super toasty, although I do plan to tear this down and attach probes. Just feeling of the underside of the board and the cold plate that's back there, which does help, you know, pull the heat away from the board as well. It's not super hot. It is warm, to be sure, but it's not alarmingly so. For gaming and DevOps workloads and just the Threadripper benchmarking, you're going to want to check out our launch day coverage. Not a lot has changed since then. If you're a hardcore developer, the sweet spot, like the best deal, by far the best bang for the buck, is the 24 core. The difference between the 24 core Threadripper and the 24 core Threadripper Pro is $1,000. And for non-creative workloads, meaning mostly developers, containers, etc., having that much more memory bandwidth isn't really worth it. Like you'd be fine on the TRX50 platform. Is it worth the $1,000 difference to you? Probably not, because 24 cores, $2,500, 24 cores versus about $1,400, $1,500. TRX50 in that universe is a little bit more of a compelling scale. If it were me, I would love to see the total platform cost at 24 cores at around that $1,000 to $1,200 mark, but that's probably not realistic in 2023, I suppose. What's ASRock got in store in their BIOS? Well, I was actually surprised that ASRock has really dressed up the BIOS. It doesn't look very servery. It looks like one of their regular motherboards. They haven't locked out any of the AMD CBS or PBS options. They've definitely done a better job than ASUS in terms of hiding all of the enterprise stuff. But the CXL options and the error generation RAS options and other options like that are still exposed. Turning on CXL and trying to use a basic CXL 1.1 device doesn't seem to work under Linux, but I don't think it's really meant to on the workstation platform. Similarly, enabling the encrypted memory, like the options are there in BIOS, but it doesn't seem like this platform really wants to use encrypted memory, I guess. I had to clear my CMOS a few times playing with some of the settings. Options like NPS1 versus NPS4, they can be useful for gaming. Like by default, this shows up as one NUMA node with 32 cores. You can split it into NPS4 and have a little bit better memory latency. Other BIOS options, you can enable Expo, XMP like you'd expect, overclocking. The curve optimizer is here, all of the usual AMD options, all of the options that you would expect to dovetail with Ryzen Master are of course here. You can configure the PCIe slots to be X4, X4, X4 or X8, X8. There's no more exotic options like X8, X4, X4. That makes sense, although I am trying to design my own MCIO PCIe adapters so that I can give you a PCIe card in the level 1 tech store where it's like, hey, you plug this in your X16 slot and you get an X8 MCIO connection and 2 X4 MCIO connections or 4 X4 MCIO connections. Probably the more likely initial variant, because a lot of motherboards don't give you the option to bifurcate as X8, X4, X4. This one also included, but hey, stay tuned, that could be a thing. They could probably enable that without a lot of work, assuming that I can get, you know, a bunch of those made and actually maintain PCIe Gen 5 signal integrity. Probably just gonna end up wasting a bunch of money. Thanks for supporting level 1. But anyway, I digress. The BIOS is pretty well put together, mostly. There are some egregious bugs. There are some, like you can set NPS 4 in like 4 places, and at least one of them has an option, NPS 0, which is for multi-socket configurations, which should not be there on Threadripper because it's not a multi-socket configuration. NPS 0 takes a 2-socket server and makes it behave like it's one giant NUMA node for especially crappy and broken software. Windows. well, older versions of Windows anyway. But yeah, you know, it's just teething issues from new platform and BIOS. And it's like, which options should we hide? It's like, I don't know, let's not hide anything. So I'd rather them not hide anything than overly hide other things. Linux platform support, if you're going to build a Linux workstation around this, out of the box with the latest 6.2 or greater kernels. I've really only tested Manjaro/Arch and Pop! OS, and with 6.2 kernels and later, some of them with bleeding edge. And your Linux experience on the newer kernels, this platform, basically fine. It's a Realtek ALC 1220, plus you got the Marvell chipset. That works pretty well. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a headache getting the right firmware package for the Realtek 2.5 gig LAN. It worked out of the box on the Pop! OS configuration, but I think I would rather stick to the Aquantia anyway. I did not test it extensively. Got a link I could ping, but that's about all I had time for this video. So you're gonna have to stay tuned for more on that. But by and large, basically everything is okay on Linux. So this is a good board to build around your Linux platform, especially because the MCIO Gen 5 connector, plus also you get the Slim SAS connections. You can run those Slim SAS connections for SATA devices as well. So if you wanted to run 12 SATA hard drives off of this, you get the new 45 drives home lab chassis, and you're looking to build a home lab around something that is insanely powerful, but also insanely inexpensive for as insanely powerful and modern as it is. This motherboard will run 12 of your 15 SATA bays by itself. Just plug it into the motherboard. Not even using any PCIe slots. How cool is that? ASRock giveth and ASRock taketh away. The test results from the T700 are really interesting. So, you just have a flat metal plate. That's the cooling for the T700. The T700 runs hot, with our Intel Arc GPU also swapping in a particularly warm-blooded aftermarket 4080 from ASUS. The ASUS card dumps a lot of heat at the edge of the card. The Arc, not really so much, but the T700 will thermal throttle. It is easy to get yourself into a position where it will thermal throttle. To prevent it from thermal throttling, I added a fan at the front here. That was all it took. This fan is not even running at 1,000 RPMs. It's like 500 RPM. So your case selection and case cooling is going to matter substantially. And it was also silent throttling. There were no warnings or anything like that. If I wasn't paying attention to it and looking for it specifically in Hardware Info 64, the symptoms would manifest as a relatively slow write speed. And to be sure, writing is when you're going to run into most of the throttling. Although if you had more than a 10-minute read workload, you could also sustain throttling. If you were playing a game or something like that where the GPU was dumping tons of heat, I could see that maybe you would get into a situation where level loading or something like that would throttle, but I was really only able to reproduce that in artificial workload scenarios as opposed to actually playing a game like Cyberpunk 2077 to see what it would do. It also made a huge difference depending on how I torqued down the heatsink. So like just unmounting the heatsink, remounting the heatsink, being very careful to move between the screws to keep even pressure on the T700 made much more of a difference in terms of the cooling and thermal throttling of the T700. So I think the blazing M.2 placement on this motherboard is perhaps a little unfortunate. If you're relegated to using M.2 cheat codes, this particular one for our Kioxia CM7 Gen 5 redriver, well, that's not going to work at all with the GPU in the way. You could move your GPU to another slot. In fact, you could move it to the very bottom Gen 5 slot that runs at X16, and then you'll have plenty of clearance around your M.2. That's actually probably something you should really actually do. The TRX50 motherboards are a little more, expense oriented, let's say, and so you're not going to be able to do the fun little thing where you can run the GPU off of the very last slot in the motherboard. There's no right angle connectors or anything like that we saw in last generation. So if you were going to run it in an XL case and move the GPU to the end so you can use all your PCIe slots, that's not going to work out for you here. And so if you're a little flexible on where you can physically mount your GPU, then you're not going to have any T700 throttling problems. You're not going to have any problems with your M.2 cheat codes if you're going to put things other than, a high-speed Gen 5 SSD in the M.2. You're going to be able to get creative. All right, let's see what this thing looks like. Like, what would the most compact tower case look like for this, now that I'm reasonably satisfied that our workbench is basically going to be okay? That's the Fractal North. This is one that I actually bought at Micro Center. This is an EATX motherboard. This is not an EATX case, and yet it will work. You're not going to be able to hide your cables. You're not going to be able to use the rubber grommets unless you get really insanely creative. The motherboard will fit. Not recommended. You can put giant GPUs in here, but again, not super recommended. If you were going to do a 360mm cooler, I would not at all recommend this case. You could get the mesh side panel and then use a 280mm cooler. That might possibly be okay, but for our Arctic Freezer 4U, this is the most compact Threadripper workstation case build thing that you can do and still get reasonable cooling, although you may end up having to upgrade the front fans for something that are a little bit more CFM. In a nutshell, ASRock does bring a powerful enough VRM platform that you can do some significant overclocking here. I think they've got the winning formula with the MCIO connectors. In fact, I would have loved to have seen the server-style 8-lane MCIO connector or more multiple Gen 5 MCIO connectors because, hey, TRX50 has got the lanes. If you don't want to add the PCIe slots, add the MCIO connectors. I mean, come on. It'll be fine. I really hope that we see more MCIO connectors on TRX50 workstation motherboards. That's going to be with us through PCIe Gen 6 probably, and the MCIO cables themselves with the redrivers and retimers are going to be more likely to be a headache-free experience versus the Slim SAS Gen 4 nightmare fuel suffering land that it has been so far. I mean, I've had a terrible time trying to get Slim SAS Gen 4 RAID controller breakout. Like, it's madness. There's so many threads on the level 1 forums. A very normie pleb and I, we have suffered tremendously just trying to have stable Gen 4 peripherals not through a PCIe slot. I mean, what is this, 1637? We gotta have our high-speed signaling. What's going on? I'm This is Level 1. I'm signing out, and you can find me in the Level 1 forums. This has been a quick look at ASRock's TRX50 WS workstation board, and I gotta get this into a build. Got any questions, or you want to see something in particular with this? Let me know. I'll be glad to put it together. Hit me up at the forum. Alright, catch you later.